Hey everyone, welcome back to Secular News. Today, we're peeling back the layers on a story that shook the world: Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, when you hear about a military giant like Russia, you probably think of flawless strategy, cutting-edge tactics, and sheer unstoppable force. Right. Well, let me tell you, what actually unfolded was far from that. It was an outright disaster. Imagine this: one of the world's most powerful militaries, trying to flex its muscle, ended up fumbling in a chaotic mess of outdated intelligence, corruption, and mind-boggling miscalculations. We're talking about Russian bombers using unencrypted civilian radios to communicate, troops looting for basic necessities like food and medicine, and leaders who were completely out of touch with reality. It almost sounds like a bad joke, but the real kicker: it actually happened. Putin's Federal Security Bureau thought this would be a walk in the park. They truly believed that Ukrainians would greet them with open arms, maybe even a few cheers. Instead, they were welcomed by fierce resistance and Molotov cocktails. Why did it go so wrong? Corruption and incompetence ran so deep that those at the top were hearing nothing but comforting lies. It left Putin in an echo chamber that led straight to catastrophe. Stick around, because we're going to dig into every aspect of this blunder, from the sheer incompetence, corruption, and strategic missteps to the internal rivalries that tore the whole operation apart. Trust me, if you think you know how bad it was, you haven't heard the half of it yet. If you're as fascinated by these seismic shifts in global power dynamics as we are, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Secular News. We're here to unpack the truth behind the headlines and go beyond the surface. And your support helps us keep these conversations going. Let's dive in. Reading the room: a strategic failure. Alright, let's dive into the next big point: how Russia just completely failed to read the room during its invasion of Ukraine. Picture this: Russia, a country that prides itself on its intelligence services, really thought Ukrainians would just roll out the red carpet for them. Well, that didn't happen. Not even close. They misread the geopolitical and social landscape in a way that was, honestly, shocking for a nation with so much experience in international affairs. The Russian Federal Security Bureau, or FSB, played a key role in this major strategic blunder. They assured the Kremlin that Ukrainian citizens, especially those in the east, would welcome Russian forces as liberators. A huge overestimation. They thought the sentiments in Ukraine would be similar to those in Crimea back in 2014, where Russian-backed separatists and local actors pretty much handed over the peninsula with minimal resistance. But here's what they got wrong: a lot had changed since 2014. Ukrainian nationalism had been on the rise, and many people were aligning more and more with Western values, like democracy and integration with the European Union. The FSB's failure to gauge these changing attitudes meant that Russian troops walked right into a buzzsaw of fierce Ukrainian resistance. Now, let's not forget that this wasn't just about Ukraine. Russia also severely underestimated the response from the West. Putin assumed that Europe, being so reliant on Russian energy and dealing with its own internal political issues, wouldn't be able to present a unified front. Well, he got that wrong too. NATO members came together and supported Ukraine with military aid, logistics, and economic backing on a scale we hadn't seen in years. What Russia expected to be a divided and weak response turned into a solid wall of support for Ukraine, a classic case of misreading the room. This misjudgment didn't just hurt their invasion plans, it actively backfired, strengthening Ukraine's position both militarily and politically. And it wasn't just the West that Russia misunderstood. They also failed to grasp the spirit of the Ukrainian people themselves. You had regular civilians taking up arms, forming local defense units, and making Molotov cocktails. The Kremlin clearly did not anticipate this kind of grassroots resistance. They thought they could breeze through Ukraine, but instead, they faced a nation that had spent years preparing for a fight, especially after the 2014 Euromaidan protests. Ukrainian patriotism had only grown since then, and Russia found itself dealing not just with a military adversary, but with an entire population ready to defend their homes. All of this points to a bigger problem, a leadership cut off from reality. Putin relied on an intelligence network that was either too scared or too corrupt to give him the real story. Instead of accurate data, he got what he wanted to hear. And the consequences of that? A strategic disaster that has left Russia scrambling, both on the battlefield and in the court of global public opinion. Corruption and incompetence. Corruption and incompetence within the Russian military establishment have been significant barriers to effective operations in Ukraine. The culture of corruption, deeply ingrained in the Russian bureaucracy, manifests itself not only in poor preparation, but also in the complete misallocation of resources. Junior officers and high-ranking officials alike have been known to pocket funds intended for training and logistics. This endemic corruption resulted in a situation where essential resources, such as fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies, were reported as being fully stocked, while, in reality, they were siphoned off for personal gain. The result was a military that was ill-prepared to launch and sustain a full-scale invasion. The incompetence of the leadership exacerbated these issues. Due to the entrenched practice of vranyo, a term that describes the Russian culture of collective lying, where subordinates lie to their superiors and everyone knowingly maintains the illusion. Even President Vladimir Putin was misled about the military's actual capabilities. Reports sent to the Kremlin depicted an exaggerated picture of readiness, assuring Putin that troops were fully trained and combat-ready, while the reality was starkly different. For example, there were reports of Russian troops using outdated maps from the 1960s, which led to confusion and tactical errors during the invasion. The lack of accountability within the ranks of the military also played a crucial role in Russia's failures. Supply chains were poorly managed, with frontline units frequently finding themselves without adequate food or fuel. Instances of soldiers stealing copper wiring from their own vehicles to sell for vodka further highlight the scale of indiscipline and desperation among the troops. This degree of mismanagement significantly hindered Russia's ability to execute a coordinated and effective campaign. Furthermore, the rivalry between different factions within Russia's military leadership, such as between Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Wagner PMC's Yevgeny Prigozhin, meant that internal conflicts often took precedence over the broader strategic goals of the war. This competition led to undercutting and outright sabotage, with both sides occasionally withholding critical resources from one another. Such internal discord only served to weaken the overall military effort, revealing a fractured command structure incapable of unified action. Corruption and incompetence, therefore, weren't just ancillary problems. They were central to the repeated failures of Russia's military campaign, affecting everything from intelligence gathering to logistics and combat readiness. This systemic failure reflects deeper issues within Russia's political and military establishment that have severely undermined their war effort in Ukraine. The vranyo culture in Russian bureaucracy. Now let's dive into a concept that has a huge impact on Russia's current struggles in Ukraine, the culture of vranyo. So what is vranyo? Well, it's essentially a deeply ingrained practice of collective deception. In Russian culture, it refers to a scenario where everyone lies, and everyone knows that they're lying, but all parties pretend it's the truth. This isn't just an occasional occurrence. It's a behavior embedded into the fabric of Russian bureaucracy and governance, and it has played a big part in Russia's current predicament. Historically, vranyo traces its roots back to the Soviet era. During that time, Soviet officials were under immense pressure to meet unrealistic quotas, and the only way to meet these demands, at least on paper, was to falsify data. For example, agricultural figures were exaggerated to avoid harsh punishments, even when actual productivity was far below expectations. This system of collective deception led to a huge disconnect between reality and what was reported up the chain of command. Unfortunately, that practice hasn't gone away. It survived the Soviet Union and carried on into the modern-day Russian system. And this practice of vranyo directly impacted Russia's military preparedness when it decided to invade Ukraine. Imagine this: junior commanders would falsify training results, stating that their units were combat-ready, while in reality, The soldiers lacked adequate training, equipment, and sometimes even enough fuel to operate. As this misinformation worked its way up the chain of command, it eventually reached President Putin, who was making major military decisions based on an illusion of readiness. By the time the invasion began in 2022, Russian forces were far from prepared for the real conditions they encountered in Ukraine, leading to significant setbacks almost immediately. This culture of deception wasn't limited to the military, it extended to Russia's political and intelligence circles too. The Federal Security Service, FSB, responsible for gathering intelligence in Ukraine before the invasion, provided overly optimistic assessments that did not reflect the actual situation. These reports claimed that Ukrainians would welcome Russian forces as liberators, an assessment that proved catastrophically wrong. Intelligence officers, in an attempt to align with what they thought Putin wanted to hear, painted a rosy picture that ultimately led to a severe miscalculation of Ukrainian resistance and Western response. This Vranyo culture continues to cripple Russia's effectiveness in Ukraine. Imagine a system where telling the truth gets you punished and lying gets you rewarded. That's what this culture has created, an environment where honesty is discouraged and deception is seen as a survival tactic. This has meant that key decisions are often made based on inaccurate data, making strategic planning nearly impossible. In Ukraine, that's led to logistical nightmares, poor morale among the troops, and a leadership that's repeatedly blindsided by unexpected developments. The consequences of Vranyo are profound. It's one of the key reasons why Russian forces have struggled so much since the beginning of the invasion. They're operating under false pretenses, using faulty information that doesn't match the reality on the ground. It's a classic example of how systemic issues within a country's leadership and culture can have real, devastating effects on the battlefield. Lack of preparation and intelligence failures. Now let's talk about one of the major reasons Russia's invasion didn't go as planned: the sheer lack of preparation and massive intelligence failures. These problems were at the core of why Russia couldn't achieve its military objectives. Simply put, they were unprepared in so many ways, and it showed. From flawed assumptions about Ukraine's resilience to logistical chaos and outdated intelligence, Russia found itself stumbling from the get-go. A huge issue was that Russia assumed Ukraine would collapse within days, similar to what happened in Crimea back in 2014. The intelligence from Putin's own circle was heavily flawed. It made Russian leadership believe that Ukrainian citizens would welcome them with open arms and that resistance would be minimal. Based on these assumptions, they chose to skip crucial steps like preparatory air and missile strikes that might have weakened Ukrainian defenses. Contrast that with the US air campaign in the Iraq invasion in 2003, which systematically dismantled Iraqi infrastructure. Russia's failure to take similar action left Ukraine's forces intact, ready to fight back. And let's talk about the logistical mess that followed. You might remember that infamous 40-mile-long convoy of Russian vehicles stalled north of Kyiv. It became a symbol of how poorly thought out their supply lines were. Without enough fuel, food, or medical supplies, many Russian soldiers were left stranded, hungry, and exposed. Reports even indicated that some soldiers had to loot local stores for basic necessities. Coordination was also a disaster. Different units didn't know each other's positions, leading to chaos and missed opportunities. Another critical point of failure was intelligence gathering. The Federal Security Service, FSB, responsible for assessing Ukraine's readiness and civilian sentiment, didn't do its job effectively. Instead of providing an in-depth evaluation, they relied on outdated and overly optimistic assessments. The FSB believed that Ukrainians would welcome Russian forces as liberators, which couldn't have been further from the truth. This misconception led to serious setbacks on the battlefield. And then there's corruption. It's rumored that millions of dollars meant for intelligence operations were misappropriated by FSB officials. With such mismanagement, Russian troops entered Ukraine without clear objectives or the information they needed. There were reports of soldiers using maps from the 1960s and even relying on printouts from Wikipedia to operate heavy weaponry. Imagine that in a modern-day military operation. Communication failures also played a big role. Many Russian soldiers used their personal cell phones to communicate, which led to significant security breaches. Ukrainian forces, backed by Western intelligence, intercepted these communications, allowing them to precisely track and target Russian units. Not having secure communication tools was a major oversight that exposed troops to deadly counterattacks. All these factors, flawed assumptions, lack of supplies, outdated intelligence, and poor communication, combined to undermine Russia's campaign. What should have been a rapid operation turned into a long, drawn-out conflict that has cost Russia dearly. It's a clear example of how being unprepared can completely derail even the most confident military plans. Division and rivalries within Russian forces. Now let's dive into one of the biggest reasons for Russia's struggles in Ukraine: the division and rivalry within its own forces. You see, it's not just Ukraine's resilience that's been a thorn in Russia's side. It's also the internal bickering among Russian military leaders. The most notable rivalry was between former defense minister Sergei Shoigu and Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner PMC, a private military company that was a key player in Russia's operations in Ukraine. Wagner was second in importance only to Russia's official military, and the friction between these two entities often led to significant consequences on the battlefield. To give you an example, the Ministry of Defense reportedly withheld artillery shells from Wagner, trying to limit the group's effectiveness and even increase their casualties. In retaliation, Wagner allegedly fed information to Ukrainian forces about the whereabouts of Russian military officers, leading to targeted strikes by American HIMARS-launched rockets. Imagine that. Two groups supposedly fighting for the same cause were actively undermining each other. These infighting incidents directly weakened Russia's operations and highlighted a deep mistrust among different factions. Things came to a head during Prigozhin's infamous march on Moscow in June 2023. This event really showed just how disorganized things were within Russian ranks. Some military officials were rumored to initially support Prigozhin, but most ended up siding with Shoigu and Putin, effectively quashing any chance of a rebellion. But let's be honest, the mere fact that this march even happened tells us a lot about the level of chaos behind the scenes. Putin's strategy of fostering internal competition to maintain his grip on power might have worked to keep potential threats divided, but it came at a high cost. It weakened the military's cohesion and led to catastrophic losses on the battlefield. So, when we look at Russia's struggles in Ukraine, it's not just about facing a united Ukrainian front or underestimating Western support. It's also about the fractured command structure that resulted from internal rivalries and distrust. These divisions made it nearly impossible for the Russian military to operate effectively as a cohesive force. It's a classic example of how internal politics can severely impact a nation's ability to achieve its military objectives. Underestimating the West. So, we've broken down the incompetence, the corruption, the infighting, all the reasons why Russia's military effort in Ukraine stumbled. But what truly sealed Russia's fate, the real nail in the coffin for Putin's strategy, was underestimating the West. Back in 2014, when Russia took Crimea, the response was muted. Some diplomatic words, a few sanctions that barely stung. Putin thought he could pull the same trick in 2022, expecting the world to shrug again. But this time, the West didn't just react, it roared. NATO and the EU, far from being fragmented, presented a united front. They moved quickly, targeting Russia's economy where it hurt the most, cutting off banks from SWIFT, halting key projects like Nord Stream 2. These weren't hollow threats, they were calculated moves to choke Russia's economic arteries. And it wasn't just governments. When companies started pulling out, some of the biggest tech firms on the planet, it wasn't about profit anymore, it was about principle. The exodus from Russia slammed not just consumer markets, but also the technology sector that Russia badly needs. Putin thought businesses would stick around for the money, but he was wrong. The result? Isolation. Economic pain that's far deeper than anyone in the Kremlin anticipated. And then there was the military aid. In 2014, Ukraine got some helmets and medical supplies. But in 2022, the West delivered intelligence, precision rockets, and modern weapons, all in record time. Germany's historic shift, stepping up with military support, shattered Putin's expectations that Europe would cower in fear of energy repercussions. NATO itself grew stronger, reinforcing its presence and showing Putin that aggression comes with a price. Putin miscalculated, thinking the West was divided, weak, too comfortable to bother. What he found instead was resilience, unity, and a willingness to endure economic pain for a greater cause. Now, Russia is paying the price. A drawn-out war, crippling sanctions, and global isolation. This may well be the defining mistake of Putin's career. And that brings us to the question, how will this story unfold next? Will Russia find a way out, or has Putin written himself into a corner he can't escape from? I'd love to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown insightful, give it a like. And hey, if you want more in-depth, no-nonsense analysis on the biggest events around the world, make sure you subscribe. Your support means a lot, and it helps us keep bringing you the stories that matter. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more on Secular News.